Okay, just to the north of the Terrace of the Elephants is the Terrace of the Leper King. You can see it. I'm standing on the other side of the street opposite the arrow that comes from the word of after Terrace. Okay, this is the Terrace of the Leper King, and again I read from the Lonely Planet Guide. This 7-meter or 21-foot high pavilion or terrace once supported a large statue of what is known as the Leprous King, and it also supported a pavilion made of lightweight materials. I don't know what the structure to the right is, or the remnant of the structure, and whether that includes as part of the terrace. It's not clear. Now this 21 feet of height includes 5 tiers of meticulously executed carvings of seated apsaras, which I'm not sure what that means, kings with short double-edged swords, and princesses, the latter adorned with beautiful rows of pearls. So I'm going to pan slowly down through these 5 tiers and then see if we can find even better detail. It's interesting to look at the corner reliefs because they're different, number one. And notice how plain amorphous this one is, almost as though the stonework was supposed to be a device for holding other, let's say, applied stucco sculpturing. But you can see that that working of the stone continues all along as a motif to the stone, very much like the Anasazi did. And I don't know why the guidebook says 5 tiers, there are 6. Again, and here in the middle is a relief in which the entire surface is that pecked surface, whereas the stones on either side are more normally carved with different textures. Look at the facial expression. Here are the finer detail. Now these panels are interesting. Fish. Looks like a turtle. More fish. Now here on the south side, the guidebook nicely points out that there's this narrow access to a hidden terrace that was covered up when the outer structure was built. So the idea of expanding, very much like they did at Teotihuacan, over 9 generations actually. What is fortunate about expansion is that it preserves, in this beautiful detail, what was original and would have been lost to the weather had it not been preserved this way. Here we see exactly what it would have been like. Whether these were painted or not, here are the 7 cobra heads. Now here the heads have been damaged, probably because they protruded out. But notice the fine detail of the snake's skin. Whether these were painted originally or not, I don't know. But this probably reflects part of the retinue that the king had at one time at least. And here are the 7 cobras on a corner relief, which is more interesting even. Looking at this beautiful detail, we can extrapolate to everything that we're seeing. Here the design of the fans that the maidens would have used to cool. This is like finding a lost pharaoh's tomb. Probably a symbolic knife. One has to be careful interpreting the actions of some of these characters. This inner temple, original temples, to me, one of the priceless assets at least available to an unknowledgeable tourist, because it gives you a very, very good idea of what everything else was. Well, this is kind of a cavalier, relaxed attitude, whereas this one looking more regal, powerful. Now this side, which is the east side, is very worn, and it may well be that this original temple even stood for a long time exposed to the elements. And I wonder if these characters were made in situ, in other words, right here, where the stones sit, or whether they were like mass manufactured and then just put in place in order. Now here I'm on the terrace of the Leper King, looking across at the north end of the Terrace of the Elephants and seeing this upper portion which was not present at the south end, and that is a podium there, if you will, or a platform, a base that might have held a huge statue of either Vishnu or of the king himself. Okay, now I'm standing on top of the Leper King Terrace, almost on top. I'll walk up a little bit higher here. And we can see some apparently original statues that were here, 4 of them, and they surrounded a reproduction of the leprous king, which doesn't seem to show any evidence of such a malady. Again, from up here, I don't know if this portion to the north is part of this terrace complex or not. It certainly clearly appears to be connected. Whether there was a duplication of the temple that we've just been up on top of and walked in the innards of, whether that was to the north here where we're looking or not, I don't know. But you can see the original retaining wall for this backside of this terrace. Notice all about are these rows of stones, which represents the stones that were not put in place either because they didn't know where to put them or they didn't need them to do the attempted reconstruct of the wall. And this is true of almost any kind of nation's huge monuments, the ancient ones, is that there will be these stacks of stones the archaeologists have put aside. You wonder if someday archaeologists will somehow have some magical way, as DNA would have seemed magical 50 years ago, to place all these stones properly. Or is it even necessary? Okay, so we've seen the Terrace of the Leper King, the Terrace of the Elephants, and now we'll walk down to Baphoun, which is that temple I've marked as number 2 to the lower left of the Temple of the Elephants. And then we'll go down to the Bayon. There's some pretty detail on just random stones. Not to take anything away from the skill of the carvers, this is sandstone, so it's very easy to carve as opposed to the basalt that the Incas, were working in. Okay, I'm standing on the street just below the words Terrace of the Elephants, in front of the Baphoun, looking at it. So we'll go explore this front portion that you see dead center right now, and then we'll go to the left back into the complex itself. Okay, that is the south side of the Temple of the Elephants. Now I'm going to pan across the front of the Baphoun and read from the Lonely Planet. This is a pyramidal representation of mythical Mount Meru that marked the center of the city that existed before the construction of Angkor Thom. Restoration efforts were disrupted by the Cambodian Civil War. All records were destroyed during the Khmer years. The criminals of that Khmer Rouge will probably escape any prosecution at all. And French experts were pretty much puzzled by the world's largest 3D jigsaw puzzle. Doesn't appear to be much in the way of detail to see here, although the steps would have been pretty. You can see that they were heavily reliefed, at least geometrically, as was the faces to the side, and apparently this entire wall. No other kind of detail. It looks like there were niches up there where statues might have been. There were certainly columns, and this probably rose to a considerable majestic height. Okay, this would have been the entryway seen across the heads of the hordes of tourists. Probably these were very beautifully fashioned ponds originally that flanked this causeway that we're walking down. I think a very dramatic way to approach a temple complex. And you can see holes and other depressions in the side of this walkway, which probably meant there was a banister here. And here we approach another structure that had a series of gateways or doorways within it, and windows, and a pretty little pond out to the left of it. And here are some of the stones that certainly belong to the rest of the structure. You can see that the doorways were nicely formed geometrically, as were the windows, it looks like, at least some of them. And looking at this stone, I'm just wondering if this reflects the technique that the holes were used for, where they held surface carvings. Okay, the building itself starts down there to the left and continues all around. Access. Little detail is available, so we'll search for it where we can. Notice the ribbing on the roof, kind of interesting. And it would have ended with some kind of decoration, which the nubs of which remain, it looks like. This temple is more Muslim in design, in the sense that it's only in this sense. I don't think there's any Muslim influence here, in the sense that it's geometric, dominates the design elements rather than and motifs rather than figures. Although here's an example of both. It's interesting how chunks were assembled in the attempt to reconstruct, and are still left here in the hopes that they can, as units or subunits, be used again. Flowers, quite naturally, are a motif used in all cultures, it seems like, somehow, somewhere, simply because that's natural to the world that they lived in. Someday these elements will stand again. This is probably the best idea we're going to get of what this building surface contained. It's surprising to me now that I think about it that more cultures in the world, particularly first world cultures who have the money to spend, don't use themes from these older cultures as a norm, so that, like the Romans did of the Greeks, and then Europe did of the Romans later. I saw evidence of such themes, but Asian, at the equivalent of that Home Depot that I spent time in Bangkok, but I haven't seen those same items in the United States, for example, although I'll go online and see if they exist. These animals look European, or even like Eastern Mediterranean, Western Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. Here's some of the effort. Man has a wire brush that he's using to clean up these stones, but they've decided apparently that this bunch of stones is going to get moved. It's going to be interesting to see how these guys are going to get this thing over onto that truck over there. My guess is they'll do it by hand somehow. Unless they get to use that crane, which would make sense. Here's how they'll do it. Makes sense. And probably move it over to the site where the crane is. I wonder how much he gets paid relative to these laborers. Here we go. Gonna have an accident. Boy, that sure as hell isn't OSHA approved. But hell. Here we get a view, different view. And they can see the work that's going on in that upper tier. Probably the entire upper portion has to be rebuilt since the Khmer's destroyed it. You can see throughout examples of restoration. And this retaining wall was apparently built in the 15th and 16th century. And like Palenque and Tikal, all around the perimeter of structures like this are mounds with rocks on them or around them or sticking out of them, which in those places heralds other structure. Now as I pan around, this is the warehousing work center. You'll see other huge stone blocks that are new in preparation for this rebuild project. Perhaps over there they actually manufacture some of this, but look at the huge mounds of rocks. Probably the ones surrounding those trees are the ones that were left over after they culled out the ones that had some connection to another stone and some possible use so far as motif and design was concerned. This may be the living quarters of these men, at least on a daily basis. And here, looking at the entrance to that temple, again, you can see that there was a pedestal on top that probably held a killer statue. There's now an international accord that attempts to hold the criminals who destroy purposely a country's monuments and historical artifacts. I think the punishment should be, as they used, I think, and perhaps in Venice, but they were placed alive in a small metal cage and then suspended on posts in the bay. And as the tide went in and out, their bodies were more and more exposed, of course, but they were left there to rot. To give a criminal like Saddam Hussein a hanging is like giving some serial killer a slap on the wrist. Here are a couple of units in the scrapyard that will certainly find a place. Here's the view from that main entrance along the causeway. How impressive this must have been when it was brand new. And how regal that procession must have looked. There's supposed to be an observation deck, so I'm going to go over to the other side and see if there is. How strange and perhaps disorderly all this would have looked to the original people who constructed this temple originally. Of course, they would require an incredible imagination to even envision this project or its necessity. But does this give us a hint as to what it might have been like when it was being built? Here, notice again this long wall of the Terrace of the Elephants. So this compound went far back from the buildings that we were visiting. Can we even begin to imagine the amount of effort that it took, not to mention skill, to make just these little post devices? And then look at the acres and acres of stone that's been worked and carved, and then was lifted and fitted into place. Can we even begin to imagine the effort when it was mostly done by hand? Imagine making these curves. Yeah, I believe I'm now approaching Bayon from the northwest corner as you see it here. Must have been a real allure for hunters, not that I would ever want to be a hunter, but who came to Africa and places like that and traipse out into the wild on an elephant, which would make you feel invincible, particularly with your weapon. Here we are at a Buddha shrine that has been clearly restored. Notice to the left here and farther down are those pairs of stones, or allusions to the pair of stones that we saw in the temples in Thailand. This doesn't really offer us anything novel or even anything close to the spectacularness of the many things we see. Okay, this is the Bayon, and I'll read from the Lonely Planet guidebook as I pan about. This epitomizes the creative genius and inflated ego of Cambodia's legendary King Jayavarman VII. 54 Gothic towers famously decorated with 216 enormous, coldly smiling faces of some long name that bear more than a passing resemblance to the king himself. Many faces glare down from every angle, every perspective, as a way of dramatizing the incredible power that this king had over all that he was in control of, and his goal of making it clear to all who might look at this temple. Things we can pick out from here is the many windows as well as entrances into the temple compound proper. Here the lion, probably a statue of the king, more nagas and their banisters, columns all the way around. And maybe these columns had a covering over an arcade there where those people are walking. Here, of course, a pedestal that would have held a companion statue. Here, just looking at the flagstone, you can see how gravity and time and weather tears apart structures like this that the builders thought were forever. And all of these windows probably just gave continuing views of the large faces of the long name of the kingly resemblance. Again, a view that encompassed these terraced walkways with rows of columns and nagas that framed the stairways that gave access. Here's a complete wall of details that are hard to fathom because of the moss and so forth. This looks like a scene of battle. Certainly elephants there, men on top with their long spears, foot soldiers beneath. Look at the weapons they carry, those hooked knives. Horses. Get a little idea of either the dress or the armament that they had. Here a little bit better detail. There you can clearly see the device, the platform, or more like a little cubby hole that the warrior rides in. Looks like it gave him some protection, maybe from arrows and so forth. The guidebook suggests there are 1.3 kilometers of over 11,000 reliefs. Remember, sandstone that is not yet metamorphosized into marble is extremely vulnerable to water. Here are reliefs above one of the doors. Again, from here you can see how you could look down these long corridors on either side of the central entranceway. Here's some more reliefs in very good condition. These look like they've been sanded or restored a bit. I'm guessing that this is the exfoliation of the sandstone itself rather than that of some kind of stucco applied. This may be a hint as to how some of these long, nicely carved columns were used as part of the decoration on the sides of doors and windows. But again, what were the holes used for? Were they attachment points? Perhaps so. But why it was to be a hole in the middle of that frame of the door? Again, how this entry step would have been so lovely when it was brand new. Here I'll just pan this inner courtyard, inner from that colonnaded walkway that I was standing in. Again, notice how the walls are being buttressed against the gravity. Okay, let's take a closer look at these faces while the sun is obliterated a bit by the clouds. Now I'm panning up to the top just to see how many faces we'll see there on the way up. Of course, many may be lost now. So panning down this courtyard again. I don't know if this was covered or not. I don't think so. There, a small temple. I don't know whether this detail was actually here as a kind of a monumental sub-wall, if you will, or whether they just assembled these pieces here. By you can see elements in piles and further down there, or maybe it was this side of that major wall, I don't know. And some pretty relief up on the higher level there. You can see that one of those windows was closed in just for stability. And here a stupa, or Chedai design building. Here's a small Buddha where they make an offering on your behalf and prompt a donation. I think this arch may be called a corbel arch. Same kind used in one of the inner pyramid rooms. Here another arched ceiling. And this looks like another walkway up through doorways of some sort. And an inner court within the inner court. Or just at the base of the temple itself, rather, excuse me. This is an inner courtyard area. You know what it was used for, who knows? This must have been so incredibly beautiful. Yikes. And here another Chedai type temple building. Another kind of monument device, usually covered with flowers and reeds. And notice these square holes here, which means there was some kind of a wood ceiling or pavilion over the front here. Yeah, I'm now inside this little temple. You can see how involved these were. The hole reached right up, presumably light came down and dropped right onto what probably was a Buddha right here. And this is the intersection of 4 corridors. Now, this is probably an original wall of the original main temple. And these other areas that I've been traveling in were added after the fact. Pretty obvious. And yet, for some reason, they felt it important to provide all this decoration and access around the perimeter of this new tightly packed monument. Even this looks to be a separate structure than the main one, than that one that's right straight ahead that we can see there, and this main structure here. So this may be the intersection of 3 buildings, and yet reasonably highly decorated. Again, a labyrinth of walkways, and another Buddha shrine, I'm sure. Here I'll pan just a few of the towers you can see from here, as well as Long Name's face. And the tops of those arched walkways that we were in. You can imagine how spectacular this would have looked when it was new. Tower after tower after tower. Much of what was at top has, of course, fallen down. The guide stopped here, so this is their obligatory stop to look at some detail. And the lady dutifully told her husband exactly how many faces he could shoot from here and make sure he got the other 2, keeping score. Just imagine if there was a time when this lion looked out to the trees instead of to the buildings that were built around it. It's hard to piece all this together in a vision. These columns would have had very detailed but thin engraving on them. Some nice protected detail above this doorway. This is the quieter northwest corner entrance to the palace complex. There were several entrances, it looks like, on each side. This is the main center entrance on the west wall. Much quieter, doesn't have the tours. Notice the big wall there. Let's look at those graffiti, those detail. Similar to what we saw before, but perhaps telling a different story. Notice that these two upper rows of armed soldiers are at first traveling above water. There are fishes underneath them. Here it looks like underneath those three holes a man jabbing something, maybe a serpent. You can see that they carried shields. Here it looks like this man has dominion over the one he has his hand on and the one that has his arm underneath his leg, although it looks like our hero might be ready to get a spear in the side. But on the other hand, one man seems to be down with a spear in his side. So this seems to be the heat of the battle here. Someone on an elephant there with a parasol. Looks like the shaft of the parasol may be broken. Don't know. Are they now in fields of lotus blossoms? Don't know. Oh, here are archers. Here from the central entrance we can see at least two more entrance areas. Okay, I'm looking down the route that I think goes to Angkor Wat, and hopefully if I can stay in the shade it should be a relatively nice trip. Then from there I'll try and get a tuk-tuk back to town. Hopefully diffuse that guy's tuk-tuk driver's comment that I couldn't get a ride back. It's very much in their interest to lie. similar to the one I saw in Thailand. Not quite, I don't think. This, I think, is the south gate into Angkor Thom. Seems like a big, somewhat impregnable wall, at least in the ages when they didn't have cannons. Wonder what an elephant could do ramming into that, but maybe they didn't think of that. This is an interesting motif. Each of these characters holding on to his part of the railing all the way across the bridge. It's a pretty long wall. Some kind of animal over there. Notice their posture, their left leg forward, their right leg out to the side for balance. Their left knee is supporting the balance, and their right arm is holding it. It would have been extremely pretty, particularly if this was a continuous, well-kept moat. That would have been a bear to get across, I would think. Here, a restored head, or at least one that's nicely cleaned up. Here's a good view of the posture. This would have been impressive as any European king could have come up with.